In all the last couple videos, we've been looking at specialization in trade from a national perspective. We've been looking at it in terms of why does a country choose particular products to export and sell to other countries? Why do they import other products? Let's now take that discussion back to where we started, which is why do businesses specialize in trade? And so as we do that, we need to make an amendment to the production possibility frontier. When we drew the production possibility frontier before, we had two goods, A and B, and our production possibility frontier was this straight line. But when we're looking at it from an individual business's perspective, we have to recognize the production possibility frontier isn't a nice straight line. It actually has this shape. And what is this shape? We talked about that earlier this semester. It is concave. Okay. And that's because businesses don't have an infinite amount of resources. They have a finite amount of resources. And so when we consider the production by a company or a smaller entity, we have to consider the additional limitation in terms of the finite level of resources. When we're looking at it from a country perspective, there's a lot more resources available. Now, the production possibility frontier shows those combination of goods that a country or a company can produce. And it assumes we're using all of our resources. Okay, we talked about how points below that production possibility frontier, we're not using all of our factors of production. And we talked about how without trade, it was impossible to get outside the PPF. What we're going to look at now is the PPF for an individual business and how we can get that PPF to shift out here so that businesses can make more of multiple goods. So let's dig more into this concave shape. And this concave shape has to do with what is called the law of increasing cost. So let's just walk through an example of that. So let's suppose that you have an apple orchard and you like to take your apples and turn them into cider, or you make apple pie. Okay. Now, you only have so many apples. You have a finite number of resources. Let's suppose you've harvested your apples. Here's your buckets of apples. And if you use all of your apples on cider, you can make 10 jugs. Okay. Now, what if you decide instead of using all of your apples for cider, you'd like to make some apple pie? Okay, here's all your apples. You're going to make that first apple pie, which is going to then reduce the amount of cider that you're going to be able to make. So, which apples do you use? Well, probably for your apple pie, you're going to pick the biggest, the nicest, the prettiest. So, when we go to make that first apple pie, the amount of sacrifice that's being made, how much cider we're giving up, to make that first apple pie is probably not a ton. Because if these are all the nicest and the best apples, we don't need a ton of them. All right? But what if you go to make that second apple? Which apples are you choosing now for your apple pie? Well, the first apple pie included all the best and nicest. So now we're going to need more apples because we have some worms and bruises we have to kind of cut out. So now we're going to have to use up more apples for that second apple pie because these aren't as good as that first set of apples. So the sacrifice in terms of the cider starts to become greater. Now, as we go to make that third apple pie, all the really good apples win in the first pie, the second best win in the second pie. The third apple pie is going to need a lot more apples because they're a lot more bruised and not as good. And now we're giving up a lot of cider to do it. So notice that because we had a finite amount of resources and we had to choose which ones went into the pie and which ones went into the cider, the level of sacrifice changed. Now, remember back when we talked about consumers and our budget line? The slope of the budget line told us opportunity cost. Well, the slope of the production possibility frontier shows you the opportunity cost for the business. And here, what we can see is that the cost to make the apple pie at the beginning, not much sacrifice. But as we start to make the next apple pie, we are now having to give up a lot more cider to make the next pie. So the sacrifice we're making is changing because we have a finite amount of resources. This is the law of increasing cost. But the cost to make the apple pies is increasing because we're going to have to sacrifice more and more of the cider. Well, how could you go about getting more cider and more apple pie? How do you shift that entire production possibility frontier outward? Well, how do you get more of all goods? You need new technology. Maybe we get an apple core that allows us to keep more of the apple and use it for either cider or apple pie. Okay. Maybe we find ways to be more efficient, right? How we can get more for less. In our paper airplane demo, maybe we can pre-fold our planes so that it's much quicker to fold them, right? A process that is quicker. Or a machine, technology that allows us to be more efficient. Or what if we have more factors of production? So what if we had more apples? If we had more apples, we could make more apple pie and more cider. In our demo that we did, we essentially, because we kept unfolding our paper and reusing it each round, we essentially had this unlimited supply of paper. But if this was a real production company, you only have so much paper available to you. In which case we have to decide which paper goes into the baseballs, which paper goes into the airplanes. And so for our company, we would actually have this concave production possibility frontier. And so how would we then get more baseballs and more airplanes produced? Besides specializing in trading, we would need more paper, or we would need more people on our teams to be producing, right? That's how we could shift out that production possibility frontier. Now, in all of our discussion over these last number of videos, we've been looking at how we decide what to specialize in. We make what we have the comparative advantage in. We make what we have the least sacrifice in. And for our country examples, we held that sacrifice, that opportunity cost, constant, right? You found that helped you find the trade rate, and you could find a point out here. For a business, that opportunity cost is changing as you change the amount that you produce, which impacts the cost. All of these, though, have been looking at this value in terms of the trade-off, one good for another. In the next couple of videos we're going to now look at costs in terms of dollars. So we're going to look at the costs of production and productivity, not in terms of the other good we could have been making, but in terms of the dollar value. It's these combined that determine how much gets made, how much we charge. But the first question we have to answer is, what do we specialize in? And that's what we've been looking at. We specialize in what we have the least sacrifice to do, the lowest opportunity cost, the comparative advantage.